It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are? I was sitting on the couch, reading and drinking a glass of wine, when the phone rang. Sighing, I put the glass down and went to the phone. Who would be calling at this hour? Annoyed, I picked up. Hello, I asked, hearing breathing and then a slow, deep voice. It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are? What do you mean? I asked, but the caller disconnected. Some stupid prank, I figured, and returned to my book. The next night, I was getting ready for bed when the phone rang again. Unthinking, I answered and heard the same breathing. It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are? Who is this? I asked, annoyed, but they were no longer there. I went upstairs to check on the kids. They were fine, and I pushed it from my mind. The next night, I picked up on the first ring. It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are? Who is this? I demanded angrily. If this is a prank, it's not funny. Stop harassing me or I'll call the police. There was a pause. I wouldn't recommend that. You may not like the outcome. The line disconnected. I called the police, but they said without more information there wasn't much they could do. The following morning, I found one of my kids' dolls on my car windshield, with a knife through the heart. The next night I was ready. The phone rang. It's 10 p.m. Do you? I'm tired of this game, you sick son of a bitch. You're scaring my kids. Stop calling me, or I'll find you. A pause. I'd like to see you try. Click. Really? I'd show this bastard. I used software to look up the phone number. Not so anonymous after all. 30 minutes later, I was standing outside a nondescript suburban house. I stared at the door, the voice repeating on a loop in my head. Do you know where? Do you know? Do you? Louder and louder, until I couldn't think of anything else. Then I was inside, and on the stairs, and in the bedroom, and all I saw was red and silver and red and red and... The night orderly spoke to his colleague as they changed shifts. So what happened with this one? The day orderly looked up, glancing away from the young, attractive woman in the straitjacket. She was found crouched over a body, holding a knife and soaked in blood. Apparently her last baby being stillborn pushed her over the edge. I guess she decided it was her OB/GYN's fault. Strangest thing, though. What's that? The relief asked. They found a nursery in her house with 4 cribs with blankets and bottles. And according to the video footage from inside the victim's house, the whole time she was stabbing him, she just kept shouting the same thing over and over again. Leave my children alone. So, before the last stillbirth, she'd had 4 miscarriages. She didn't have any kids.
I went hunting and it was the biggest mistake of my life. My name is John, and for 7 years, something has followed me from a hunting trip I went on. So for some background, I loved hunting ever since I was a child. At 10, I first went hunting with my father, and I've hunted all my life. As far as I can remember, I have enjoyed outdoor sports. But about 7 years ago, when I was 23, I went out on a hunting trip by myself. I was missing every shot due to where I was. Fairly uneven terrain, so I went to another spot. That's when I spotted what appeared to be an altar. It was about 3 feet tall, 8 feet long. I went to investigate. The altar had blood on it. I was confused, and a little worried about what I'd find around it. I looked around and saw nothing and no one. I looked for traces of any dead bodies buried nearby, and when I went back, the altar's top had been lifted off, and nothing was there. I thought it was weird, but paid very little mind to it. I left and then, when headed back to my truck, I spotted something in the distance. It looked like a giant praying mantis, but that wasn't possible. It was black in color, and was about as large as a bear, so I thought it was a black bear. I went to my truck and got in. I started the engine and left. When I made it home that night, I felt uneasy, and like something was watching me. I ignored it, because the doors and windows were all locked. I even made sure to check everywhere in my bedroom before bed. My girlfriend came home that night. She had been on a vacation with her family. I welcomed her home, and she asked me with horror in her voice, "What is that?" She pointed behind me. There was nothing there. She had a history of schizophrenia, however she always took her medication, surely she did not forget it. Did she? I played this off as a schizophrenic episode, so I told her to calm down and that nothing was there. I brought her to the bedroom and went to sleep. About 2 days later is when things really ramped up. I was at my father's home. He told me that he saw something along the tree line of his farm. I noticed it too. It was the same thing I saw prior, like a black bear. I got my rifle from my truck and aimed at it through a scope. I checked to see what it was, and the reality was more horrifying than I thought it ever could be. It had 6 legs, 2 of which were propped up similar to a praying mantis. Its body was covered in black plating, and compared to a tree, it was maybe 10 feet tall. My expression had dropped, and I was now shivering with terror. My father asked, "John?" I had remained silent. I lowered my gun and turned to him and said, "I don't know what that is." And gave him the gun. When he looked, he saw it too. Its eyes were almost piercing, like they cut your soul in two. My girlfriend came out of the house with my mother. They were chatting about something, I can't recall. I had been too shaken up. In fact, my father to this day does not remember anything about that day except that thing. It was like everything was wiped from his memory on that day. And it was fair to say, really. The way it looked was more grotesque than I can put into words. And later in the night, my father suffered a heart attack. The fear that was prior in the day overworked his heart, and it was still beating in anxiety, I'd imagine. So he had a heart attack. My mother was worried for him, and I did not tell her what I thought caused it. I never told her it, nor will I. My father was released 2 weeks later. Since then, I had been having encounters with it on my property. I even fired a few rounds at it. Contrary to what you'd think, it did nothing to it, so I began buying progressively higher power guns. On night 9, my girlfriend, we can call her Sarah, awoke and screamed. When I woke up, that thing was jumping out of our bedroom window. I got up and grabbed the rifle I keep in our room, and aimed at it as it was scurrying off. Then it crossed the street into a cornfield. I could not see it to get a clear shot, so I aimed and fired once. Of course, it did nothing to it. I was starting to get pissed, thinking, why won't it do anything to this thing? How tough is it? I was absolutely horrified. This was the first time I had experienced true terror. I felt powerless. If this thing wanted, it could kill me at any moment. So, I prepared a trap. In my third barn, I put barbed wire at foot level, and a puddle of gasoline just far enough so something would fall into it. I had a bit of gunpowder that I'd ignite and toss down, which I had hoped would kill it. Sarah's schizophrenic episodes got worse. She forgot to take her medication more often. At the time, I didn't know it was that thing boosting our anxieties. Sarah broke down one morning, even going as far as to injure herself. I had to send her to the hospital for stitches. And at this point, I was tired. And I was going to slaughter it, in any way I knew how. So, I lured it out, and put my plan into effect. It gone off without a hitch, until the end. It exited the flaming wreck that was my third barn. This thing was pissed off now. It released some sort of sound, which made me fall to my knees vomit. After I got up, I ran to my truck, got in, and started it. It pursued me while I drove away, and it was keeping pace until my truck hit 110 miles per hour. I was too busy looking in the rear view mirror to notice the turn coming up. I looked back and then turned. At 112 miles per hour, I crashed my truck. It flipped too many times for me to count. I unbuckled my seatbelt and fell down onto the roof. I crawled out, slowly blacking out. The last thing I saw was that thing, doing the equivalent of laughing, like a taunt. I fell unconscious and woke up in the hospital later. I looked around, of course in a daze. A nurse said something. I could not make it out, but it was something along the lines of, "You had a pretty bad wreck, but you're okay now." I was focused on if Sarah was okay. I was clearly high on this painkiller they were giving me, so I couldn't do much. The day after, I was released from the hospital. Sarah was already back home, and I went there. Sarah was in the bathroom when I arrived, showering. I walked to the living room and laid down, exhausted, more mentally than physically. When Sarah finished showering and put on new clothes, she told me to come up to our room. I did so, and she pointed out amongst the trees, that thing was watching us. Later in life, I called it, the stalker. For it stalking us, I grabbed my strongest rifle and then went outside. By the time I made it outside, it was gone. Every day since then, it had been doing the same, until last year, around my birthday, Sarah and I were freshly married, and we had moved from Montana to Kansas to get away from it. Only 2 weeks later, it showed up, and on every third day, it began to show up. After studying it for 2 weeks, I had realized I was cursed. I began to use holy items as weapons against it, although I had no faith at the time, so it was fairly useless against it. So I went to a priest. He told me, "Give it up to God, and you will be freed." So I did that. The last time I had ever seen it, it was absolutely furious. It attacked me, pinning me to the ground and clawing at me. I had to cover my head and vital organs. It shredded up my right hand, and broke my left forearm. It chewed up one of my feet as well. I'm glad I taught Sarah how to shoot though. She shot it in the back of the head in the place with thinnest armor, knocking it down and hitting it into a small daze. I got up and Sarah assisted me in walking away. It dove at me, but it faded into darkness. To this day, I attribute what we did to the work of God, and I am now proudly a preacher. To this day, we have not seen it again. I'm a single mom. I never knew who the donor was. Now there's something very wrong with my son. It all started when I got divorced at the age of 39, and was left with a choice. Return to the dating circuit, as my single girlfriends would jokingly refer to it, and take my chances on finding a man ready to jump right into having a family, or explore alternative means of having a child, on my own. On my own. The very sound of it terrified me. But when I thought about starting a relationship all over again after 10 long years of trying to salvage one, going it alone didn't sound so bad. And so, the next day, I began looking into artificial insemination by way of an anonymous sperm donation. A week after that, I was at a fertility clinic, looking through a database containing profiles of potential anonymous donors and making arrangements for a procedure. A month after that, I was pregnant. And 9 months after that, I was giving birth to my beautiful baby boy, David. And while I didn't know who David's biological father was, it didn't matter. I was his mother. He was my son. And we were in it together. That is, until almost 7 years later, when I received a call from an unknown number that would change my life forever. "Hello," I answered. "Is this Mary Birch?" A man asked on the other line. "Yes, this is she," I replied, prepared to hang up at the earliest sign of spam risk. The same Mary Birch who received an artificial insemination from an anonymous sperm donor 7 years ago tomorrow. Fuck. I thought to myself, assuming that after all these years, the anonymous donor himself had suddenly come looking for me, or worse. David, this is Ryan McDonald. I was a nurse at the fertility clinic where you chose your anonymous donor and underwent your procedure. Okay, I replied, unsure of where he was going with it. Mary, I'm not sure exactly how to tell you this, but there's something you need to know about David. What? And I need to tell you before tomorrow. Later that night, I was sitting at a diner, texting David's babysitter his dietary restrictions, while at the same time researching where to rent a bouncy house for his 7th birthday the next day, when Ryan McDonald sat down in the booth across from me. He didn't look familiar, but in my defense, it had been almost 7 years, and it wasn't like I ever got to know any of the countless nurses I had met during the process. This is going to be difficult to hear, Ryan began, before taking a deep breath. But David isn't the only child conceived using his biological father's sperm. Fair enough. I always knew there was a chance that there were others out there, I replied, relieved to hear what I assumed was why he brought me there. But my assumption was very wrong. Yeah, but the thing is, he added, before hesitating, and then leaning in to whisper to me. The others. There's something very wrong with them. Oh, well, I guess I lucked out then, I said defensively, 'cause David is the most level-headed child. I honestly couldn't have asked for a more well-behaved kid. See, that's the thing, Ryan continued, so were they. Until their 7th birthdays. 7th birthdays. Well, what happened then? They turned into what? Killers. I stopped for a minute and went completely silent, as he looked at me sympathetically. Until I suddenly burst out laughing. Killers. That's a good one. Hold on, I called out, as I looked around the diner. Where are the hidden cameras? You're pranking me, right? I'm afraid not, Mary. That's when he pulled out the newspaper clippings. There were 9 stories in total, about 9 different children. Each one having either gone on a killing spree, or attempted to, just after turning 7 years old. And, according to Ryan, each one a child of the donor, as he kept referring to him. David, from what we know, is the 10th and final child. He concluded, as he put the clippings back in his pocket. The whole thing was all so overdramatic, so far-fetched, and so disrespectful to both me and my son, that whatever amusement I was finding in it had long faded away. Instead, it was actually starting to piss me off. If you'll excuse me, Mr. McDonald, I'd better be going. I'm afraid your joke has gone a little too far, I declared with a scowl, as I grabbed my purse and stormed away. Wait, he called out, we need to talk about the donor. But I'd already made up my mind. By the time I got home, David was fast asleep in his bedroom, and the babysitter was anxiously waiting to leave. After handing her some cash and heading upstairs, I got ready for bed, and put on some reality TV, to help get my mind off the bizarre and unsettling encounter at the diner. But when the clock struck midnight, and it officially became David's 7th birthday, I couldn't help but be reminded of Ryan's warning. See, that's the thing, so were they. Until their 7th birthdays. Asterisk. Don't worry about it. It's just a bunch of nonsense, I whispered to myself, as I pulled the comforter over my head, shut off the light, and turned in for the night. But just as I was falling asleep, I was suddenly awoken by a strange noise emanating from the hallway, specifically David's bedroom. Cracking the door and tiptoeing down the hall, I slowly approached it. And as I got closer, and closer, and closer, the noise grew louder, and louder, and louder, until I reached the door to David's room, and was able to hear the sound more clearly. It was a growling noise, accented by what sounded like howling and drooling. Surely, Ryan was right, and there was, in fact, something wrong with David. I thought to myself, terrified by what might have come over him. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, not knowing what to do. Until I eventually worked up the courage to grab the doorknob and fling open the door. Only to find David curled up in bed, watching a horror movie, its hero on the verge of being devoured by a zombie. Phew, I thought to myself, realizing that the film was the source of the unsettling sounds that I'd heard. Before my relief turned to anger. David, what are you doing? It's way past your bedtime. Sorry, Mom, my son replied, looking even more scared than the movie's main character, and than I had just been, as he scrambled to find the clicker and turn off the TV. Then I remembered that it was David's birthday, and suddenly felt bad. So I decided to let him watch TV until the movie ended, under one condition. That he be on his best behavior at his birthday party the next day. But despite our agreement, when David's 7th birthday party commenced in our backyard the next day, something came over him that I'd never seen before. A strange irritability, a temper that, had I not seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't have believed he was capable of. Seemingly out of nowhere, after showing his friend Bobby one of his birthday gifts, he suddenly snatched it back and yelled, "Give it back. It's not yours, it's mine." before shoving him to the ground. "David!" I screamed, as Bobby's eyes welled up, and the other moms looked on in surprise. "That's enough. Now get inside and go to your room. Until I say otherwise." "But Mom," he cried back. "I said go. Now." I insisted. But rather than continue to argue, his face suddenly turned blank and he simply walked back inside. "Are you okay, Bobby?" I asked his friend, who had just picked himself up off the ground, and appeared to be fine, before turning to Bobby's mother, Roxy. "I am so sorry about that. I have no idea what's gotten into him." But Roxy didn't say anything. She just stood there, silently, her mouth agape and her eyes wide in fear, as she looked over my shoulder. I turned around, to find David, standing at the door to the backyard, holding a steak knife. "David!" I began to scold him, but he had already come charging at me, as the rest of the party-goers cried out in horror. Now it's important to know why my husband had left so many years ago. Truth is, he had a terrible temper, and was prone to psychological and emotional abuse. He had never laid a finger on me, until one day, when, in the middle of a fight, he seemingly out of nowhere, picked up a kitchen knife and threatened to use it on me. Suffice to say, a month later, we had filed for divorce. Which is why, in that moment, as my child held one of his own, repeating history, I simply froze. As he grew closer, and closer, and closer, raising his weapon in the air, ready to strike. But before he was able to bring the knife down on me, suddenly a hand emerged out of nowhere and caught his arm, freezing his blade in midair, just an inch from my face. And when I turned to investigate who had saved me from my child, I saw Ryan McDonald standing there, a look of sorrow in his eyes, as if to say, "Told ya so." But all he said was, "We have to talk about the donor."